Affirmative action really comes up in the 1960s as basically a recognition of the fact that you can't change the deeply entrenched racial inequalities without a conscious plan to address them. So affirmative action in college access and in employment were all about expanding the search, reaching out to bring more people into the systems, and giving them the assistance that's necessary to get them there, and considering people beyond the normal metrics, looking for people who might have talents that don't show up under the normal processes of thinking about standardized test scores, for example. So the idea that almost all the selective colleges in the United States adopted was to take into special consideration the groups of students from historically excluded populations that had never had real access to selective higher education. And it's been followed now for over a half century, and most of the institutions in the country where it's not explicitly prohibited by state law continue to believe it's a necessary tool, and so do most of the researchers who study it. Fisher versus the University of Texas is a case brought by a single student, Ms. Fisher, who claims that she was discriminated against in not being admitted to the University of Texas at Austin, even though the university said she would not have been admitted in any case, even if affirmative action hadn't existed, because she lacked the necessary qualifications. She actually went to Louisiana State University. She no longer wants to be admitted to the University of Texas, and it was not a class action suit representing the whole white population, for example. So many people consider the case to be deeply flawed. Because it was only a case about one student rather than a whole group of students, like the Michigan case and other affirmative action cases, the University of Texas basically did not do a broad preparation to defend the whole policy of affirmative action. It tried to defeat this individual case. The Supreme Court surprised many people by taking a case that had so many procedural and practical flaws and was so limited in its record. Those of us who believe that there's a majority on the Supreme Court that wants to limit affirmative action think that they basically took it because the University of Texas at Austin has the most credible or seemingly most credible alternative to affirmative action in the Texas 10% plan, which we don't believe is a good substitute, and the university doesn't, but at least it did something significant, unlike many other substitutes for affirmative action. There's many misconceptions. One of them is that it's a quota system. Quotas have always been outlawed under affirmative action, well, at least since the Bakke decision in 1978, which is now, 40 years in the back. But people still think it's true. No college has been able to operate with any kind of racial quota, certainly since the Supreme Court's decision in Bakke. So it's about, and the idea that students are admitted simply on the basis of their race or ethnicity is also a myth. That was also forbidden in the Bakke decision, and that prohibition was underlined in the Michigan decisions. So all colleges can do is what Justice Powell said in the Bakke decision in 1978. Consider it as a plus factor together with many other plus factors that they're looking at in the admissions process. So you may get more credit for being a volleyball player or a tuba player or coming from some little rural area in your state than you get on the basis of being a historically excluded group of students. The justification for affirmative action since 1978 in legal sense has been primarily because it enriches the educational experience of all students in the college. People consider it a zero-sum game where if white students or Asian students lose, when black or Latino students are admitted, But the evidence that we have shows that it's not a zero-sum game. It's a positive-sum game where all the students gain significantly in their educational opportunities and in their preparation for life in their community and in their job sites from being in a diverse educational setting. Well, some people say we don't need affirmative action because we could just admit poor students or students with low incomes. And it is good to look for poor students. And the University of Texas, in fact, has affirmative action for both non-white students and low-income students. Low-income students do suffer usually unequal preparation, unequal family resources, and many other problems. But race and class are not the same thing. Middle-class blacks and Latinos are not treated the same as middle-class whites in our society. For example, the typical middle-class black family in many places lives in a community that has more poor people in it and in its schools than the typical low-income white family because of housing discrimination and because of the lack of networks that connect them with more favorable communities. That's not a class issue. Another problem is that class is very difficult to measure. If we just use free lunch status, for example, which is what we usually use, we pick up students who are, whose parents are temporarily unemployed, people who have recently gone through a divorce. We pick up new immigrants. We pick up a lot of people who aren't disadvantaged and who actually have a lot of social capital. And we don't pick up a lot of students whose families have a little higher income but have none of that social capital that other families have. Also, wealth is much more unequally distributed than income, and we really don't measure wealth in affirmative action cases. We found in an experiment here in California that the principal beneficiary of looking at income plus qualifications were not blacks, were not Latinos, that were Asian immigrants. People who hadn't lived in this country before and who obviously can't claim that they were discriminated against in this country since they're just arrived and they wanted to arrive. That's not who we should try to advantage through affirmative action policy. So what we say is there isn't a simple substitute that really can deal with all the dimensions of race. For example, middle-class black men are stopped on highways. They are followed in stores and so forth, even if they go to an Ivy League school. That's not class, that's race. Race matters tremendously still, and we can't pretend that it doesn't and have colleges that reflect the reality of our society. I believe the immediate future of affirmative action is going to be difficult because we're probably going to get a decision from the Supreme Court that will limit its reach and will create additional barriers. And we already have a really serious underrepresentation of African American and Latino students, Native American students in our selective colleges and universities, even with affirmative action. That's another myth about affirmative action. It never created fair representation. It just did better than nothing. But there's still massive underrepresentation, and the underrepresentation has been increasing rather than diminishing. So we're going to be faced with our colleges in the 43 states that have affirmative action trying to decide what to do, and the private colleges all over the country that have had affirmative action trying to decide how to accommodate major changes. And to get any kind of a reasonable partial substitute for affirmative action requires a lot of money and a lot of specific targeted programs that try to target on racially segregated or impoverished, deeply impoverished schools, or a variety of other measures that are indirect measures that connect to minority status. If we're going to do that, we have to have major commitment from institutions. And the institutions, at the best, will take a while to figure out how to do that and to decide to commit the resources. At the worst, they'll decide to do nothing. They'll just decide this is so complicated and so costly, we'll just stop doing it, and maybe accept the view of the conservatives on the Supreme Court that we don't need it anymore, which would be, in my view, very sad because it would produce a major loss of minority representation. We have a lot of difficult issues we're going to have to face in financial aid when we can't practice affirmative action. I think that we're going to have arguments and difficult struggles inside of many of our universities and colleges and many of our state governments and so forth to decide whether we're going to do something that can overcome, at least in part, the losses that we'll suffer from limits on affirmative action. So in the long run, I'm more optimistic. The country's changing. It's obvious in recent elections. We're kind of in the last generation of a white majority. I think as the country changes, the courts will change, will become more open to this. This is a decision that's going to be made by a majority of one. There are 5 very conservative members of the Supreme Court. That Supreme Court isn't eternal. New members could create a new understanding of these issues. So my view is we'll have to come back. If we lose this issue in this decision, colleges and universities will have to decide what they can do, what's the best that they can do, and communities that are concerned about this issue will have to play a very active role in that process. But at the same time, there'll have to be more research documenting the value of affirmative action, more research documenting the inadequacies of the substitutes, and a continued legal struggle, because this is an issue that won't go away. And since our colleges allocate so much of opportunity in our society now, it's an issue that we'll have to come back to and eventually get a decision that more adequately reflects the needs of the society. I think parents, teachers, members of the community, they need to realize that the universities shouldn't just be trusted to deal with this issue. They should be held accountable. Everybody pays for them, especially the public universities, and everybody has a right to ask what they're doing. And they need to be ready to be active both inside of each university and at the state level where policies are formed and programs are funded. There need to be voice of the communities that are going to be hurt by this process. And that's not just a concern for minority communities, because we know affirmative action is beneficial for white students and Asian students and students of privilege, because they have to figure out how to live in a diverse society successfully if they're going to be effective in the future of this changing country. So anybody who cares about this has got to pull up their socks and do some work on it and organize and have voice in making the decisions that are coming along.